Evolution is true. Bet you didn't think you were going to be hearing that from me, huh? Well, technically, evolution is a true fact. However, I have a problem with the Darwinian idea of macroevolution, as we're going to call it. It is part of the reason I tend to say that the teleological argument is one of the least relevant in our current situation, because the idea of Darwinian evolution supposedly answers it. So as a rule of thumb, I try not to emphasize the teleological too much, just so that we don't get bogged down in a discussion about evolution. Evolution, of course, has no good answer for the moral and for the cosmological argument. But that doesn't mean that the teleological is irrelevant. Indeed, it's still incredibly important to the discussion. So we're going to be going over why Darwinian evolution is not an answer to the teleological argument. Welcome to the Gospel Call, brought to you by the Purcellville Church of Christ. So you've heard me use the word macroevolution. What is the distinction that I am making here between what must be microevolution? You'll often hear people say that evolution is a fact, and although it's called the theory of evolution, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be considered as untrue. And this is a little bit of a muddling of the details here, and pretty important ones as well. We who are believers in God do not deny that evolution is true. We deny that Darwinian macroevolution is true. So what's the difference? The word evolution itself simply means change over time. Specifically, for our intents and purposes, it means change in species over generations. Now, people are correct when they say that evolution is a fact. If you take something like, say, a dog, you can change the features of that dog over generations. That's why we have dogs that are as large as a Saint Bernard, and then you have dogs as small as a Chihuahua. You can have short-haired dogs, long-haired dogs, dogs of different personalities, all sorts of different dogs. Well, how do we get all of these, even though they have a common ancestral species? It's because of that change over time. Now, dogs may not be the best example of evolution, because that change over time was man-made. It was men selecting certain dogs to breed and to have offspring based on traits that they had. For example, if you had one dog that was lazy and you had a dog that was hyper, you might say, you know what, that hyper dog makes a better shepherd dog. So you take the one hyper dog and you breed it with another hyper dog, and wouldn't you know it, they have a bunch of hyper puppies, and then you can keep going in that direction. Nature works in a similar fashion. However, nature does not choose which ones should reproduce based on what suits man or what suits the animal. It's going to do this based on what allows the animal to survive long enough to reproduce, and how often they're going to be able to reproduce, and how well the offspring of the reproduction are going to be able to do the same thing. So in nature, sometimes we see similar species of animal have changes over time, specifically to deal with their environment. What Charles Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands, for example, is a completely legitimate observation. He sees, for example, that there are different finches, and some of these finches have these long, pointy beaks that are good for getting into tree bark and getting at insects, and then he sees that some finches have these much rounder, bigger beaks that are good for cracking nuts. He finds the ones with the nut-cracking beaks in islands that have a lot of nuts, and he sees the ones with the sharp beaks in islands that have a lot of insects. So we can see how change over time, there must have been an original species that both of these split off from, and we can see that how change over time has made them into different things. This is something that we who are God believers do not deny. We understand that change happens over time to different species. But where the fact goes to theory is that this is the origin of species, as Darwin titled his book. That this is where all animals come from and why there are different animals. However, the fact changes from the theory very quickly. I'd like to point out two places in which the theory of macroevolution, and that is the difference between microevolution, is you might have a bird over here that changes its beak shape, but with macroevolution, we're going to see something entirely different. Instead of a small change, like a beak, we're going to see changes over millions of years that are going to result in drastic changes. Changes like fish developing lungs and flopping onto land to learn how to breathe. This is where the theory of evolution and macroevolution start to play a part. Often we hear that if something cannot be observed, then it cannot be. This is a philosophically fallacious argument and belief known as scientism. That's the idea that you can only know something through science. I'd like to note that I'm not saying that science doesn't have the ability to tell us a great many things, but science cannot tell us everything. Science has no ability, for example, to tell us whether or not something is beautiful. We have to use something else for that. There's a great deal of things that science is not capable of telling us. So, you often hear, for example, that if something cannot be observed, then it cannot be said to be true. But we can't observe macroevolution. We can only observe that microevolution. You can observe through several generations a species changing over time. But you cannot observe over several generations it gaining new features entirely. You can breed a dog for as many generations as you want with the more selective, more efficient man-made breeding and reproduction, but you're never going to get a flying dog. The basic features of dog have not changed over time. They still have some basic features. They're all still mammals. They still have eyes and ears and claws at their feet and sharp teeth, and they still have the same basic dietary needs, etc., etc. You are never going to be able to breed a dog in such a way that it eventually gets gills and scales, even if you had millions of years to do so. This is where this theory of macroevolution breaks down. Now, I'm certainly not a scientist, and nor is that my inclination. So I'd like to borrow from the work of Dr. Thomas B. Warren in his debate with Dr. Anthony Flew over the existence of God back in 1977. Now, I'm going to read, and I might skip over a few parts that are simply dealing with the debate itself. Keep in mind that this is a debate, not a book about evolution in general, so I might make a couple of skips that don't make sense if you don't know the debate context. Warren says, "Here we look at the detail of the respiratory system, a part of it, the alveolus, a blood vessel, and the air. Now we go on quickly to a description of what happens here. These alveoli are grape-like bunches of very small air sacs. Each person has approximately 750 million of these. All of them together, likely, have a surface area which is about 25 times that of the skin. Spread out flat, they would probably cover as much as 600 square feet. Compare a room of about 30 by 20 feet. Each alveolus is covered with a network of capillaries. These capillaries are so small that red blood cells must pass through them, one cell at a time, through the very thin walls of the capillary. The blood gives up its waste, that is, carbon dioxide, and takes on refreshing, life-giving oxygen. Now note carefully that without this exchange, the interchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, no human being could live more than a few moments. The body's entire blood supply must pass through these small blood vessels every few minutes. The blood goes in one end, a dark blue-black, and out the other, a bright cherry red. Day and night, this process must go on without interruption. It is clear from these facts that man did not evolve by mere chance from rocks and dirt and water and gas or whatever he wants to put by way of dead matter. So what does this mean? Dr. Warren is telling us that there is a process that goes on in your body at all times about the exchange of oxygen, which is insanely complex. And if it did not happen all of the time, if your body at all places suddenly stopped doing this, you would be dead within a few seconds. Why is this important? Because it only works at this level of complexity. If it were more simple, it simply would not work. And when we listen to all of what was being described there, the complexity is insane. But according to macroevolution, in order to gain something like this, of course, it's not going to be said that these just pop into existence. Instead, they have to slowly, over generations, form. But if you're going without it for a few seconds, it's completely useless. So what's the point of forming it in the first place? Remember that a huge part of evolution is natural selection. And because natural selection is only going to make the things that are useful and the things that are important stay within the body, why would something like this process ever show up? Now, this is only one example of many, many examples in which you can see a feature on a living being that could not have slowly come in over time as a result of natural selection. Some of these processes, like the one we just went over, are deadly if they do not occur. Others just don't make sense to continue on the species because in their simpler forms, they simply don't help anything to survive. Let's take the eye, for example. Now, what the Darwinist would say about the eye is no, the eye did not just pop out of nowhere, and the eye, of course, is an incredibly complex organ, but instead, it developed slowly, and the first eyes were an organ on some species that were incredibly simple, and really all they could do was tell whether or not there was light. They were used for perceiving light. And while there might be some survival advantages for that, we still have to recognize that being able to sense something, getting an organ just pop up in one generation that's going to be able to sense light isn't going to happen. So in order for this to happen, it's going to have to go several generations in which an organ that is slowly moving in the direction to even be able to sense light in the first place is going to develop. Problem is, that's not going to help you survive until it can sense light. In fact, an eye is a bit of a weak spot, isn't it? I'm sure we've all gotten dirt in our eyes. If you look at the human skull, and if you wanted to figure out the easiest way to get to the brain, go for the eye sockets. There's a weakening in that defense system, isn't there? And before it gives us the ability to see or even perceive light, which would take thousands of generations, it's completely useless. So why would natural selection then say, oh, it's fine, you're just going to keep this, and this is going to somehow help you to survive better? It doesn't make sense. There are a lot of problems that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface with concerning Darwinistic evolution, such as the fact that it violates the law of identity, at least how it's often explained, or that it depends entirely upon beneficial mutation of something that is not within the genetic code to begin with, which has never been observed. But we're not going to obsess with the problems of evolution, at least not for now. We might come back to it at another date. But for now, we would just like to say that the theory of Darwinistic evolution is certainly not an explanation and a answer to the teleological argument. Of course, if you disagree with us, we want to have a discussion with you. That's part of the reason we have this podcast in the first place. So if you have any questions or comments, we would ask that you please email us at thegospelcallpodcast@gmail.com. That's thegospelcallpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. And who knows, your question or comment might just get answered here on the air. For the Purcellville Church of Christ, I'm DJ Kessinger. Thank you so much for listening.